Let's switch over and start talking about soybeans. Soybeans are planted on a similar timeline as corn, planted in the months of the last part of April through the month of June, growing through the summer months, and harvested from October and November primarily. So they worry about similar things as what we discussed for the corn market. If there's a drought during the months of June and July, you'll see highly volatile prices and rapid spikes. If there's a really wet spring, then the price can be affected by this concern about whether acres will shift from corn to soybeans or vice versa. The figure shown here comes from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, and we see planted acres displayed in the red bars and the yield trend over time in the blue line. You can see that acres have been trending upward, getting close to 90 million acres in recent years, and yields have been trending upward as well, although the upward trend has not been nearly as pronounced as what we saw in the corn figure. So what do we do with the soybeans that we produce? We export about half of it, and the rest we crush into soybean meal and soybean oil. Soybean oil is used in a variety of ways for human consumption. You can go to the grocery store and buy it. It's also used to produce biodiesel. And soybean meal is a high-value animal protein that's got a lot of protein in it, therefore making it highly valuable in animal feed. So on the right axis, you can see displayed the percent of the soybean crop that's exported, and on the left axis, you can see how many million bushels we've been producing. So you can see that production has been trending upward over time, but the share of production exported has remained constant. So that means if we're thinking about how much we're consuming domestically and how much we're exporting, we're kind of increasing those numbers proportionally as we've been increasing production. Let's switch over and start talking about the basics of the wheat market. In the United States, there's 3 primary types of wheat grown, and each different type has its own futures market. There's U.S. hard red winter wheat, also known as Kansas City wheat because it's traded on the Kansas City Board of Trade. Hard red spring wheat, also known as Minneapolis wheat because it trades on the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. And soft red winter wheat, also known as Chicago wheat because it trades on the Chicago Board of Trade. So they're so different that they have their own kind of futures contract. And what makes them different is primarily how much protein exists in the actual kernels of grain. So that makes them useful in different kinds of applications like baking cakes and cookies versus baking breads. The figure shown here comes from the USDA Economic Research Service, and it shows, as of 1998, the area planted to each different kind of wheat. So you can see there is kind of a geographic sense to where the different kinds of wheat are planted and which futures contract it's trading. We have Kansas City wheat listed here in blue, and we have soft red winter wheat here in red, and we have spring wheat here in gold. Hard red winter wheat is planted in the fall and it lays dormant over the winter, doesn't grow very much. When the temperatures rise in the spring, it starts to sprout. It looks an awful lot like grass until it grows up and produces those heads that are so recognizable. And ultimately it's harvested during the months of May and June, primarily June. Hard red winter wheat is used primarily for bread flour. Because it has a decent protein content. Hard red spring wheat is planted in April or May and harvested around September. And this is a high protein content wheat, which makes it relatively more valuable than Kansas City wheat or Chicago wheat. So it's used primarily to increase protein content by blending with the other types of wheat. And this wheat is trading on the Minneapolis Grain Exchange. This is what soft red winter wheat looks like. It's planted in the fall, harvested in the spring, similar to hard red winter wheat. But this type of wheat has the lowest protein content, so it usually trades at a discount relative to Kansas City and Minneapolis wheat. And it's used in applications where high gluten content is not needed. So one of the funnest things to watch in the wheat market are wheat spreads. So we talked about how the different kinds of wheat have different levels of protein, and that usually manifests in differences in price too. High protein wheat will trade at a premium to low protein wheat, and the relative difference in those prices will tell you sort of how much the market is valuing protein in that given year. But it's even more interesting than that because it turns out that protein levels are related to yields. When yields are really high, protein content is naturally lower. So that gives an interesting dynamic. When yields are really high, there's a lot of wheat on the market and price levels tend to be low. But in years like that, protein can become really at a premium because there's not a lot of protein in all that wheat that's around. So in years like that, the premium paid on Minneapolis wheat can be quite significant, and that's one of the more fun things to watch in the wheat market. That's all we have for Chapter 1. Stick around for Chapter 2.